to another edition of What Do You Think? Today is Thursday, July 29th, 2021, and I wanted to wish a happy birthday to Lori, who's 39 today, and Saturday, the 31st of July, will be Carla's birthday, and Carla will also be 39. So I want to wish you both a very happy birthday. Now, I apologize for coming on a little late, but we're on, and I wanted to wrap up with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who, as you know from the previous two programs, was a Soviet dissident who spent 18 years of exile, his 20 years, 18 of which were spent in Cavendish, Vermont, which is a small town of about 1,200 people just east of Ludlow. And before we get to that, I wanted to, in getting to that, I wanted to read a small section on the first public appearance of Alexander Solzhenitsyn with his family and his secretary. He had three boys. They attended Green Mountain, or one of them at least attended Green Mountain Union High School outside of Chester. And he stayed in Cavendish from roughly 1976 winter to 1994, 18 years. And in 94, he went back to Russia. It was no longer the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had broken up as a political organization, and he was allowed to come back and spend the rest of his time in Russia, writing as he wanted to. And he actually stayed in Russia, or he remained healthy, relatively healthy, till about 2004, and I believe that's when he passed away from complications of cancer. But anyway, getting to Cavendish, this is from the book Alexander Solzhenitsyn, an autobiography written by a British author by the name of D.M. Thomas. And this was written in 97. So Alexander Solzhenitsyn is very much alive and is back in Russia. But we're going back to 77, where the simple folk of Cavendish, Vermont, are sitting in a brightly painted school gymnasium on a February evening in 1977. Politely avoided looking at the silent strangers in the front row. The stern-looking, burly, bearded man in a brown overcoat, that was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and the two women next to him, one in her 30s, and that was his wife, and the other about his age, around 60, his secretary, who spoke fluent English and would be his translator. The villagers had seen the bearded man before, on television, in newspapers, and that made him a celebrity. So there was a stirring of excitement unusual in the annual town meeting. It had been a long time, well, we're not going to, that's not relevant. Word had gotten around that this Russian writer and his family had moved last fall into the old Hoffman house and farm up the steep, long dirt track of Tracer Brook Road, northwest of the village of Cavendish. The only evidence of anyone living there for these past several months had been the tall chain-link fence topped by barbed wire, kind of reminiscent of the gulags where Solzhenitsyn spent 8 years of his life, that had sprung up all around the 50-acre property. And behind the further screen of pine and birch, the sound of hammering and building, as reportedly 2 or 3 dozen workmen had set about the task of renovating the old house. Of the rumored famous owner, there had been no sign until this meeting, the annual town meeting at the school gymnasium. There had been a lot of grumbling about the fence. Hunters, and here almost every man was a hunter, felt that they had a right to go where they wanted. As their own New England poet, Robert Frost, had written, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in and what I was walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense." But the newcomer, it seemed, followed the darker creed of the neighbor, who would growl, "Good fences make good neighbors." "Dear friends and neighbors," the bearded Russian had stood up and turned to face the audience. His incomprehensible words had been translated by the elder of the woman, who stood up also. The woman looked, because of her age and babushka roundness, a babushka is an elderly woman, or a grandma, more suited to being the writer's wife than the younger woman. Indeed, some in the audience wondered if this younger woman, Alia, was their daughter. The fluent translator was in fact his secretary, Irina Alberti, daughter of a Don Cossack Civil War emigre, widow of an Italian diplomat. Through her, Sonia, or Solzhenitsyn, Sonia was his nickname. Sonia, or Solzhenitsyn, informed 200 craning people, about a sixth of the village, that he had chosen to live in Cavendish because of the simple way of life of the people, because of the countryside and the long winters with the snow, which reminded him of Russia. It was hard to be an exile, he said. God has determined for everyone to live in that country where his or her roots are. As a growing tree sometimes dies when transplanted, the spirit of a human being also is stifled when it is removed from the place of its roots. It is a very bitter fate to think and look back at one's own country. My country, by the way, is Russia and not the Soviet Union, which is not the same thing. I was born in the year of the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917. The Bolsheviks were what we would call the communists. And I shall soon be 60, but in all my life before, I have never had a permanent home. My fence, I know, prevents your snowmobiles and hunters from going on their way. I am sorry for that and ask you to forgive me, but I have to protect myself from certain types of disturbances. In Switzerland, he lived in Zurich for 2 years after leaving the Soviet Union. In Switzerland, during the past 2 years, I had visits from KGB, or security agents from the USSR, and even here I have had death threats pushed under my gate. He saw their faces, concentrated, respectful, and even awed in an impassive way. Their plain and sober checked shirt and overalled lives could scarcely take in the drama of a writer threatened with death by the KGB. Now, why was the KGB threatening him? Because Solzhenitsyn, through his experiences in the military and subsequently in the Gulag archipelago of work camps, had a lot of embarrassing information that if he had put in his books and his fictional accounts, which were based on his own life's experiences, would be very bad press for the Soviet Union. And when he's talking in 77, the Soviet Union is still still very strong, and 1989, 1990 are still, spiritually speaking and politically speaking, very far away. Of course, a bit of fencing with some chicken wire on top isn't going to keep out the KGB, Sasha said. But it keeps away people who just want to see me. Journalists who think they should know every detail of my life and have pictures of me published. I know they are a bother to you as well, and for this I am sorry, Sasha says. Not Sasha, what am I talking about? Sonia. Sorry. I know they are a bother to you, and for this I am sorry. All my life consists of only one thing, work. Work is writing. And the characteristic of my work, of my writing, does not permit sudden interruptions and pauses. Sometimes a 5-minute interruption and the whole day is lost. Hundreds of people came to see him in Zurich, people from different nations. They came without invitation and without writing to him ahead of time. So for hundreds of hours I talked to them and my work was ruined. I had no means of stopping them. So please bear with my fence, and if you can help us preserve our privacy, we shall be very grateful. The Russian people dream of the day that they can be liberated from the Soviet system. We're talking still 12 years in the future. And when that day comes, I will thank you very much for being good friends and neighbors, and I will go home, which he did in 1994. He smiled, sat down, leaning a little toward his wife. The good Cavendish people stood to applaud him, and many came to shake hands with the couple as they prepared to leave. Deciding to go before the town meeting got properly underway, Sonia missed a demonstration of sturdy, practical democracy, not unlike the Canton election meeting he had attended in Switzerland. He had first given thought to living in Vermont in 1975 during his journeys through Canada, Alaska, and the United States. A 3-day visit to Norwich University here in Vermont at the invitation of its Russian department had impressed him, and he took to the state's climate and countryside. He had asked a young architect called Alexis Vinogradov to look out for a property, and quite quickly Vinogradov was contacting him in Zurich with an account of the Cavendish property. Sonia authorized him at once to buy it, renovate it, and build an additional library studio. The property cost the new owners $150,000, and a further $250,000 was set aside for improvements. Where did this money come from? From the publication and sale of A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Again, I just want to remind you that Nikita Khrushchev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union, gained power after Stalin died in 1953, and he initiated a movement away from the Stalinist style of government and subsequent terror, murders, and imprisonments. And so he saw this first novel by Solzhenitsyn as a way of taking the Soviet Union away from that form of government and its nightmarish experience through collectivization, the Second World War, etc. Almost a year after the original purchase in the fall of 1975, the Solzhenitsyns moved in. All right, so I'm going to, let's see. Going to talk about his speech before Harvard University, the commencement of June 8th, 1978. Solzhenitsyn was invited. He was already living in Vermont, obviously in Cavendish, and was invited down to the Boston area, to Cambridge, to speak before the Harvard graduating class of 1978. Outside his 50-acre world of birch and pine, Solzhenitsyn saw chaos and approaching disaster. A world split apart was the theme and title of a lecture he gave at Harvard University in June of '78. Only 2 days before did the New York Times report that Solzhenitsyn was scheduled to give the commencement address of June 8th. Between 10 and 15,000 people stood in drizzly rain in Harvard Yard to hear him speak. They heard a lecture that seemed to take almost everyone, perhaps surprisingly, by surprise. He said little or nothing he had been saying for the past 4 years. But Harvard had not been listening, or he had not gathered his thoughts in such a coherent whole. The commencement address, in the words of Ronald Behrman, I'm not sure who Ronald Behrman is, but had the kind of impact made by Churchill's speech in Fulton, Missouri, warning of an iron curtain descending across Europe, and it set off an avalanche of critical misunderstanding. After the briefest of congratulations to his old and illustrious university, Solzhenitsyn evoked the Harvard motto Veritas, or truth in Latin, but not, as many must have expected, to compliment the university at having been faithful to truth. Instead, Solzhenitsyn allowed it to lead into a dire warning about the West's loss of courage. The planet was dangerously split. A physical and spiritual fight for its survival had started, and yet the West's screens and publications were filled of prescribed smiles and raised glasses. What was the joy about? He offered his audience a measure of what he called bitter truth. With characteristic fearlessness, he denounced at the very altar of the liberal establishment the pacifists who became accomplices in the betrayal of the Far Eastern nations that were part of the Soviet, that would become part of the Soviet bloc after World War II. In the genocide and suffering today imposed on 30 million people there. Do those convinced pacifists now hear the moans coming from there? Solzhenitsyn asked in thunderous evangelistic tones. Do they understand their responsibility today, or do they prefer not to hear? But this was not a diatribe against communism, which is what people expected. Indeed, he claimed that decades of suffering in the East had produced a stronger, deeper, and more interesting cast of characters than those generated by standardized Western well-being. His target was modernity itself, the flight from the spiritual world, beginning with the Renaissance, which had produced a dazzling technology, the full achievement of the rights of man, even to excess, but also moral poverty, the calamity of autonomous, irreligious, humanistic consciousness. At times he looked like Lenin, at times he looked like Fidel Castro, punching the air to hammer home his points. The numerous pacific, irreligious humanists in his bedrizzled audience became punch-drunk. They weren't used to being harangued or criticized, especially by a dissident whom they had at a distance applauded and deeply admired. And you could see he was enjoying their discomfort. In his words, "All right, you self-righteous bastards, you thought I hated communism. Well, communism came from the likes of you." It's quite a statement. A destructive and irresponsible freedom, according to Solzhenitsyn, had been granted endless space. Society had scarcely any defenses against the abyss of human decadence. Again, this is the opinion of Solzhenitsyn that we will hear shortly in a snippet of his address to the Harvard graduating class. He gave the example of motion pictures full of pornography, crime, and horror, considered to be part of freedom. The press abused their wide freedom by observing only the letter of the law without moral responsibility to its leadership or to history. There was no censorship of any obvious kind in the West, and yet fashionable trends of thought and ideas are fastidiously separated from those that are not fashionable, in Solzhenitsyn's words, and the latter, without ever being forbidden, having little chance of finding their way into the periodicals and books or being heard in colleges. The journalists and the professors planning minority or women-oriented syllabuses seethed. How dare he suggest there was any censorship in America? So right now we're going to listen to about 9 minutes of his address that June 8th, 1978. And I'm going to ask you to please bear with the filming of the time. Unfortunately, he speaks, it's not unfortunate, but his English, he did not feel his English was up to the task of communicating what he wanted to share. And so you're going to hear the voice of an interpreter. The interpreter is obviously of Russian descent and has an accent. So I'm going to ask you to, it's going to take a little concentration to hear what she is saying, but I think the effort will be rewarded by getting the gist of what he was trying to tell the graduating class of Harvard that day in 1978. So could we start rolling the video, please?
Civil rights. There are many such cases. Such a tilt of freedom in the direction of evil has come about gradually, but it was evidently born primarily out of a humanistic and benevolent concept, according to which there is no evil inherent to human nature. The world belongs to mankind, and all the defects of life are caused by wrong social systems which must be corrected. Strangely enough, though the best social conditions have been achieved in the West, there still is criminality, and there even is considerably more of it than in the pauper and lawless Soviet society. The press, too, of course, enjoys the widest freedom. I shall be using the word press to include all media. But what sort of use does it make of this freedom? Here again, the main concern is not to infringe the letter of the law. There is no true moral responsibility for deformation or disproportion. What sort of responsibility does a journalist or a newspaper have to his readers or to his history? If they have misled public opinion or the government by inaccurate information or wrong conclusions, do we know of any cases of public recognition and rectification of such mistakes by the same journalist or the same newspaper? It hardly ever happens because it would damage sales. A nation may be the victim of such a mistake, but the journalist usually always gets away with it. One may safely assume that he will start writing the opposite with renewed self-assurance. Because instant and credible information has to be given, it becomes necessary to resort to guesswork, rumors, and suppositions to fill in the voids, and none of them will ever be rectified. They will stay on in the reader's memory. How many hasty, immature, superficial, and misleading judgments are expressed every day, confusing readers without any verification. The press can both simulate public opinion and miseducate it. Thus, we may see terrorists described as heroes, or secret matters pertaining to one's nation's defense publicly revealed. Or we may witness shameless intrusion on the privacy of well-known people under the slogan, "Everyone is entitled to know everything." But this is a false slogan, characteristic of a false era. People also have the right not to know, and it's a much more valuable one. The right not to have their divine souls A person who works and leads a meaningful life does not need this excessive burdening flow of information. Hastiness and superficiality are the psychic disease of the 20th century. And more than anywhere else, this disease is reflected in the press. Such as it is, however, the press has become the greatest power within the Western countries, more powerful than the legislative power, the executive, and the judiciary. And one would then like to ask, by what law has it been elected, and to whom is it responsible? In the communist East, a journalist is frankly appointed as a state official. But who has granted Western journalists their power? For how long a time and with what prerogatives? There is yet another surprise for someone coming from the East, where the press is rigorously unified. One gradually discovers a common trend of preferences within the Western press as a whole. It is a fashion. There are generally accepted patterns of judgment. There may be common corporate interests, the sum effect being not competition, but unification. Enormous freedom exists for the press, but not for the readership, because newspapers mostly give enough stress and emphasis to those opinions which do not too openly contradict their own and the general trend. Without any censorship, in the West, fashionable trends of thought and ideas are carefully separated from those which are not fashionable. Nothing is forbidden, but what is not fashionable will hardly ever find its way into periodicals or books or be heard in colleges. Legally, your researches are free, but they are conditioned by the fashion of the day. There is no open violence, such as in the East. However, a selection dictated by fashion and the need to match mass standards frequently prevent independent-minded people from giving their contribution to public life. There is a dangerous tendency to flock together and shut off successful development. I have received letters in America from highly intelligent persons, maybe a teacher in a far-away small college, who could do much for the renewal and salvation of his country. But his country cannot hear him, because the media are not interested in him. This gives birth to strong mass prejudices, to blindness, which is most dangerous in our dynamic era. There is, for instance, a self-deluding interpretation of the contemporary world situation. It works as a sort of a petrified armor around people's minds. Human voices from 17 countries of Eastern Europe and Eastern Asia cannot pierce it. It will only be broken by the pitiless crowbar of events.
Я перечислил несколько
I
черт,
have mentioned a few
западной
traits
жизни,
of Western life
которые поражают
which
человека,
surprise and shock
пришедшего в этот
a
мир
new
по науке.
arrival to this world.
Размеры и задачи
The
этой
purpose
речи
and scope of this speech
не позволяют
will
продолжить
not allow
оценку,
me to continue such a review,
как эти особенности
to look
западного
into the
общества
influence of these Western
отражаются
characteristics on
на таких
important
важных
aspects
сторонах
of a
национального
nation's life,
существования, как образование
such
начальное,
as elementary education,
образование высшее гуманитарное
advanced education in the
и
humanities,
искусство.
and art.
Okay. Very good. And again, that was Alexander Solzhenitsyn addressing the Harvard University graduating class on June 8th, 1978, roughly about a year and a half after moving to Cavendish. And we are running late. I'm going to end it with that. And I hope you've found the program interesting, thought-provocative, and thought-provocative. And we'll be seeing each other again in August, next Thursday, from 5:30 to 6:15. Try to stay dry, warmer, or sunnier weather is coming back to us. And have a good weekend, and God bless. Bye-bye.